Hi folks, and today we're going to have a look at utilitarianism and whether or not it is a good way to approach trying to understand good, bad, right and wrong, or whether in fact the idea of utility is insufficient for understanding morality. And we're going to consider whether it's possible to even measure pleasure and happiness, let alone whether it is a good proxy for what is moral.
Okay, so what about utilitarianism then? This is one of the more complicated ones because it considers both rule and act utilitarianism. So I'll try and differentiate between the two. So is utility, i.e. the greatest good for the greatest number, the best way of assessing what's right and wrong? Well, the positives are it's not selfish. It makes great demands on individuals to sacrifice their own pleasure for the greater good. And it's progressive. It doesn't oppose anything inherently, for example, homosexuality or anything like that. However, there are negatives to the principle of utility as well. Act utilitarianism does seem to suggest that there are no natural rights, and this runs the risk of appalling consequences by trying to follow the greater good. The movie Hot Fuzz is a good one to watch from a sort of act utilitarian point of view. It does actually play into that quite a lot. Also, act utilitarianism's focus on pleasure could arguably be too narrow. Rule utilitarianism responds to this with the quality of pleasure idea, that some pleasures are better than others, but then, how do you decide which pleasures are of higher quality than others? So, is it actually possible to measure good then, in the first place? If we're going to moralise from that, can we actually measure good? You could argue yes, act utilitarianism suggests that the hedonic calculus will do the job, and it does assess many aspects of pleasure. Okay, so it's not expressly clear how to measure pleasure and pain according to the hedonic calculus or otherwise though, so this is a bit of an issue. Act utilitarianism, also relying on this hedonic calculus, runs the risk of being too complex. There we go. Lovely. Too complex to make quick decisions with. The hedonic calculus takes a lot of thinking about. So you could argue it's too complex. Also, pleasure and happiness are not the only good. Not the only goods, sorry. What about virtue? Virtuous approaches, the idea that you develop your character. This isn't covered. So is it a helpful method of decision making? Arguably yes, because it's impartial, it's democratic, because it requires you to be objective from your own personal biases, all end up being treated equally. This is good. It's secular. It doesn't rely on the existence of a god for morality. It's common sense. Maximising pleasure and minimising pain is a good aim. It's easy to understand and apply. Act utilitarianism assesses each situation by its own merits, and rule utilitarianism can rationalise the best approach in theory in advance of a situation to allow quick and effective decision making. Even if actions can be unpleasant, sometimes you have to get your hands dirty. So, you know, even if there are issues with that utilitarianism, you know, so be it. But you could also argue that there are problems with it. It does require some level of prediction of future outcomes and chains of consequences. Unlike double effect in natural law, you could still be held accountable if the greatest good doesn't come about further down the line. And utilitarianism is a good example as well of the fact that in terms of future consequences, you could end up with minority groups in particular being overly affected with this greatest good calculation, particularly into the future. If you do something towards the minority group because it's for the greatest good and it sets a precedent, then you can end up with all kinds of horrible things being done and all kinds of oppression. Pleasure and pain also do depend on an individual, and making judgments is a subjective approach, so it risks the whole idea of morality being relative. What's right for you might be wrong for someone else. How do you actually judge something by moral standards? You could argue act utilitarianism is too demanding. You can't justify enjoying, for example, a £20 meal when someone else deserves that money more. However, of course, rule utilitarianism could argue that the balance is required, because if you get rid of your entire loss of happiness, your entire happiness altogether, then overall the balance of happiness drops down. But even so, surely you should always give stuff away. From a more practical point of view, don't forget ethics should always be practical. There's a psychological issue here of getting your hands dirty all the time. We know psychologically things like post-traumatic stress disorder come about when people get their hands dirty. And maybe this suggests that some actions are inherently bad. And that actually some things should just always be avoided. There's also the risk of injustice if you take the act utilitarianism approach of suggesting that there are no natural rights. So, although it can be helpful as a method of decision making, there are lots of complexities as well. And the decision between act and rule utilitarianism is one that needs to be considered very carefully.